Today we're going to talk about how the world we live today is shaped by dollar-based system. As a single country have a national currency, for example, the US has a national currency as US dollar or Japan has national currency of yen. The only country that is national currency is also a global currency is the US, and the US based system shaped the world we live today. This happened in 1944 in Bretton Woods agreements. In that agreement, many countries that were influential in that time agreed to accept the dollar as the global currency. As a nation accept to use certain currency as their national currency, those countries that were influential in 1944 came together and accepted the dollar to be a global currency. What are the consequences of dollar to be a global currency? The consequences of that is exactly like a national currency that the bank could print money, the central bank could print money and give it to citizens of that country in order to use it. The same type of functionality is applied to US central bank or US Federal Reserve that could print money not only for a country like the US, but for the whole world. But how this impact other countries and how impact in US? The first impact is US constantly export inflation. Why is that? Because overall, the concept of inflation is when too many dollars go for too few goods. It means there are lots of money available, but there are not enough goods available. In that situation, we have a scarcity of goods and services, and that's why things get more expensive, more valuable. That's why we have inflation. But imagine a time that not too many currency or too many dollars go for too few goods. Means you could reduce the amount of dollar in the system. As you know, when the dollar is printed or created by the Federal Reserve in the US, around 40 to 50% of that dollars would not stay inside US and go around the world to be used for international trade and other purposes. So by reducing the amount of dollars in the system inside the US, you export inflation to the whole world and reduce inflation inside the US. And the consequence of that show itself in countries that are not inside the dollar-based system, because we have three type of countries: the countries that completely inside dollar-based system, the country are partially inside dollar-based system, and the countries that completely outside the dollar-based system. Let's talk about, for example, a country that almost completely is outside the dollar-based system, North Korea. So, North Korea, by excluding itself from the dollar based system, is receiving all the negativity of uh, export of inflation by US. Means it receive all the inflation that is exported to US without participating in the benefit of global trade system. So it means a country like North Korea cannot be part of global trade system because is not in the dollar based system. But at the same time, the inflation that is constantly exported by the US would end up partially in North Korea. So you receive all the inflation but don't get the benefit to be part of the global trade. So how this inflation that's export show itself in an extreme case of those countries that are outside the system. So this is a huge benefit that a country could export its inflation constantly to the whole world, and this helped to stabilize the inflation inside the US, and it could help to people have better uh, purchasing power. The second benefit of dollar-based system is US ability to have access to cheap credit. So the Treasury Department inside the US is able to issue bonds that are being bought by institution, banks, government, individual all around the world, and including individuals inside the US, bank inside the US. So everyone, every institution, banks, government around the world except the US government could loan money to the US, and the US is able to keep the interest rate low, and that is how they have access to cheap credit. Means with a very low interest rate they could have access to capital. Why is that? The reason for that is everyone in the world needs to have access to US dollar for global trade, and needs to have access to US consumer market to sell to the US consumer market. For these two reasons, many people are willing to give back certain amount of the money they accumulated as a loan, as a lending to the US to fund its budget deficit and trade deficit. As we talked about in the beginning of this video, around 50% of all created dollars inside the US leave the US and go around the world for global trade. Out of this 50%, around 60% of that dollars would come back in one form or another and be invested in the US stock market, US real estate, and other area. So this is the third benefit that the US have. So the first benefit the US has is to export inflation to the world. The second benefit, they have access to cheap credit that could fund those people that once loaned, the American citizen needs loan to start their businesses, to mortgage a home, to have their education, to buy a car. So all of these needs credit, needs cheap credit. So this cheap credit is financed by everyone around the world, every institution, bank except the US government, and those finances that come to the US and finance all these loans is why the US, the American citizen, have access to cheap credit. And the third benefit is around 60% of those 50%, means around 30% of the initial money that they left US would return to US in one way or another and and help fund the Wall Street. As you know, so this 30% of initial money that was leaving the US, it goes to the hand of oligarchs, it goes to the hand of governments, individual businessmen, banks all around the world. And when those entities realize the best investment they could have is by investing to the US stock market, they're willing to invest those money back to the US because they know there is a one big market that is dominating all other equity markets, and that's US stock market. That's why during the last 40 years, the percentage of US stock market out of all other markets around the world, all other stock markets around the world, went from 45% to 75%. Meaning 40 years ago, the portion of US stock market was around 45-40% of all stock market around the world, and now is 75%. And the second country that come close to the US is Japan by around 6%. So as you can see, you have this huge difference between the amount of money that go to different stock markets. And why is that? The reason is not only this market become the dominant market in the world for everyone around the world also American citizen to invest in the stock market. Also, when companies realize that by being inside the US, imagine you have a startup anywhere in the world, and that startup, that company realize it cannot get the financing that other company are getting inside the US, so they move their company to the US in order to have access to this financing for their startup, for their company. So it's like a magnet that attracts many companies and also individuals to the US in order to have the financing that come to the US stock market. So as you can see, that was the third benefit that the US dollar based system has for the US economy. And the fourth benefit that the US dollar based system has for the US economy is by attracting individuals, talents from all around the world. So this is kind of connected with the third benefit that we talked about. But as talents around the world realize that by coming to the US and having a startup inside the US, they could have access to finance. They really like to come to US because they know that's the best and maybe the only way they could scale up their company massively, and they come to the US. So one very clear example of that is Elon Musk. Elon Musk that was born and grew up in South Africa realized that by being in South Africa cannot have access to capital financing to um, follow his endeavor in business. So he moved to the US in order to scale up, start his startup, his company, and scale it up. In this way, he have access to capital that come from all around the world. So we went over four benefits that the US economy get from the US based system, US dollar based system. And we talk about how in this benefit could really hurt other countries and economy around the world. All these four benefits that I mentioned is only beneficial for the US and is hurtful to other countries. The first one is the US export is inflation to the whole world. It means the whole world import inflation of the US, meaning other countries not supposed to have this much of high prices, but because they absorb the inflation that coming from the US, they have higher prices. The second point we talked about is having access to cheap credit, US having access to cheap credit. So when government bank institution all around the world willing to lend money to the US and not willing to keep that money for their own country, it means the US have access to cheap credit, but other countries don't have access to cheap credit, and other countries need to pay higher amount of money to be able to borrow money. And this is the second benefit for the US, but loss for the rest of the world. The third one is any company, any innovation that happen in other countries except the US have huge disadvantage from the beginning. Not only don't have access to capital, but even if one day could somehow have access to capital and could build up its company, that company never could compete with the same idea, same industry, same sector that another company in the US is involved in. So they couldn't compete. So either they need to join them, or they need to be bought by US company, or they need to relocate to the US in order to scale up. So it's kind of stifle in innovation, stifle companies all around the world to scale up and to be strong companies. The third issue is that no other stock market would be able to have the even close amount of capital as US stock market, meaning companies other countries really struggle to have access to financing, so they couldn't have access to financing, and in this competition with American company, most likely uh, they're gonna at least struggle. And the fourth problem for the rest of the world is that the rest of the world lose all the talent that they invested in for many years. So there are a study that says most government spending on one individual in any countries is from that person, that individual is born up to bachelor's degree. So when individual born, the healthcare system that may government be involved and spend some money on that. It goes to through the kindergarten, it goes through the K-12 education that is free in many countries, and goes to higher education up to bachelor degree that is free in many countries. So all other countries outside the US spend huge amount of money on their talents or their citizen, one individual that could later be a talented person in one area or another, and all this money that are spent on that individual up to bachelor's degree, then that individual, just because don't have access to capital, don't have access to a certain thing that could not help that person to go ahead with the startup idea innovation he or she has, so he or she try to move to the US and to pursue his or her dream. So all this money is spent with all governments around the world up to bachelor degree is kind of helping the US, because that person, when after bachelor degree move to the US, that's exactly the time that that person to contribute to the society, contribute to the economy. So all governments around the world spend all this money and don't get anything back, and the US don't spend any money on that individual that go up to bachelor degree and receive all the benefit. So this is also the fourth way that every other country would be hurt by dollar based system. But this system was not supposed to be like that, because in 1944, exactly the time of this decision, one very famous economist, Keynes, that has a Keynesian economy after his name, he actually wanted to have an international mm, transaction system, international currency that is not controlled by any nations. Now I'm going to read you this excerpt to understand what happened in that time. Ideally, there should be fair and universal medium of exchange that enables all nations to convert the value produced by their people into tangible wealth and opportunity. In theory, such a global system would operate through a neutral and trusted currency, free from political control, allowing each country to participate equitably based on its real economic output in labor, goods, and resources. This was the foundation of John Maynard Keynes' proposal for a global reserve currency, the banker, at Bretton Woods. However, the United States rejected this vision and established the US dollar as the central anchor of the global financial system, effectively granting itself a privileged position within a world economy. In reality, this system has created deep structural inequality. The dollar's dominance gives the US unique advantages in borrowing, liquidity, and influence over international financial institutions such as the IMF and the SWIFT. Access to global exchange remains unequal, often dictated by geopolitical alignment rather than productive capacity. As a result, many nations rich in labor and resources remain unable to convert their value into global purchasing power, while others benefit from proximity to financial centers. Without genuine convertibility or a neutral exchange mechanism, value stays trapped within borders or erodes through exploitative trade terms, leaving large parts of the world economically dependent, undervalued, and excluded from the benefits of their own production. So, as you can see, the whole system was designed from the very beginning to benefit one country at the expense of the rest of the world. I really would like to know your idea about this subject. Please write in the comment section. Thank you. Have a good one. Bye.